Hi there, I want to welcome you to my weekly show. Thank you for tuning in this week. For those of you who have listened to me before and I certainly listened to the intro coming into the show, I am a personal injury attorney. I have one of the biggest personal injury law firms in Arizona. We have offices in both Tucson and Phoenix, Arizona. And I do this weekly show where we talk about different things that I think may interest those of you who listen on a regular basis. Sometimes they're legal topics, sometimes they're other things. But today I want to talk about football, which may surprise some of you. But really what I want to talk about is head injuries in football players. And I think the timing on this is intentional because it is now, well, I'm recording this in mid-July. By the time we probably have it up on our podcast, it'll be a week or two from now, so towards the end of July. And schools are getting ready to start again. And fall is football season. And so, with football practice starting in August, football season starting in August for high schools, junior highs, Pop Warner, all these different leagues, college football and professional football. I think it's the right time to have this conversation. And, because, again, for those of you who are listening to this, if you actually, I think, sought out the information, maybe you know a little bit about, kind of what's gone on with the NFL and head injuries over the last, I'd say 3 to 5 years. And really it's been going on a lot longer than that. It's been going on since the mid-90s, meaning the NFL has been investigating, and I say that investigating, head injuries and the damage that it causes in players. And for years, for over a decade, quite honestly, I think the NFL did its best to deny that head injuries were a problem within the NFL, to deny that head injuries received by football players lead to lifelong problems that are significant. And that was the position and perspective that the National Football League took. And it was intentional, I think. That's my opinion, based off of everything that I've read, everything that I've watched. And it's important, that, this is my information comes from the programs that I've watched about this, from the things that I've read about this. I'm not actively involved in the litigation that took place, or I was not actively involved in the litigation that took place over the last couple of years, where 5,000 NFL players brought a class action lawsuit, or I should say current and retired, but primarily retired NFL players brought a class action lawsuit against the NFL for these head injury issues. I wasn't involved in that, and so it's important you understand where my information comes from. And it comes from, quite honestly, just being interested in the topic, loving football, reading a lot about it, and watching a number of programs about this specific topic. But again, to find those things, I had to search them out. They just didn't kind of come across my desk one day. And so I thought it'd be a good thing to talk about. I'll talk about it in terms of NFL players, but my real purpose here is to provide information that I hope will be valuable to parents who have kids, quite honestly, who either play football or want to play football. Because once somebody is a grown man, and has chosen to play either college football or pro football or arena football or semi-pro football, that's a choice that somebody who's a grown man makes. When it comes to kids and parents, I wouldn't expect kids to know any of this stuff, any of the things that we're talking about today. And it's incumbent on their parents to, have this information, to have thought about this information, to have reviewed the topic, and simply make an informed decision when it comes to whether or not you think it's appropriate for your child to play football. And quite honestly, it's not just football. It's football, boxing, MMA, rugby, I think those have been and hockey. I'm not sure if I mentioned hockey. If I didn't, I will. Hockey. Those are the primary sports where players receive concussions. And that's when we talk about head injuries in sports. We're talking about concussions. We're talking about hits to the head, some severe, some so severe it actually has a significant impact on, that injury has a significant impact on the player immediately, but others that are just kind of repetitive, small, concussive impacts on a player throughout the game, throughout practice. And again, one of the things that's different with pro football and amateur sports, or professional sports and amateur sports, is professional sports have professional football players who make their living, or professional athletes who make their living playing the sport. And again, I'm talking about it in terms of football, but again, you can categorize it as professional boxers, you can categorize it as professional hockey players, but they're grown men and they're professionals. And this is how they make their living. And they don't want to be damaged in a way that won't allow them to continue to play and make their living. So they have a vested interest in it other than simply having fun and fitting in. Professional football has a players' union whose entire existence is to protect the players and take care of the players. There are attorneys involved in litigation surrounding these issues in professional sports. You have medical professionals who are actively researching this exact issue and publishing information regularly on this issue. It's being discussed at very high levels. And so because of that, how professional sports works, how professional football works has changed. But I would bet you how a junior high football team functions or a high school football team functions has not changed. And that's the key. That's why I think this podcast is important for parents, because where pro football and through kind of their collective bargaining agreement with the players union has actually over the last few years, for example, changed how many full contact practices per week will be acceptable or will be allowed, quite honestly. They've lessened the number that are allowed in order to protect the players. The league has instituted concussion, what's the best way to put it? A concussion process, for lack of a better way to put it, that all teams have to go through with players who show signs or symptoms of a concussion before they can play again. They can't just put them in and play. Things have changed within the sports, or within the sport at the highest level. But I would bet, again, I haven't been to a high school football game in years. Quite frankly, last time I went was when my daughter was a cheerleader, and before that it would have been when I played football. Again, I certainly could be wrong. I haven't been at a high school football practice since I was a high school player, which I'm now 45, so you can do the math. But I would bet high school football practice today is just like it was when I was playing. And it was full contact. You were expected to hit. The coaches expected you to hit hard. That's just the way it was. And it wasn't one day a week. It was every day. If our game was Friday, we practiced Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And then we had our game on Friday. and maybe Thursday was a little lighter from a practice standpoint. And then if the coach wasn't happy with how the team played on Friday, you also practiced Saturday, and it was typically full contact and hard hitting. Where most pro players have very little contact involved in their practices once the season gets started. And even in preseason, they have limited contact that takes place in order to avoid concussive injuries, in order to protect the players. And so I don't think that happens at the high school or junior high level like it does at college and specifically the professional level. So how big of a deal is it? It's huge. The studies have shown that, quite honestly, let's look at it this way. When you look at the federal court documents, and I'm glancing over at some things, but when you look at the federal court documents that were filed in the NFL concussion lawsuit, essentially, if you sort through those, the parties expect that nearly a third of all retired players will develop long-term cognitive problems. And those conditions are will most likely emerge at much younger ages than they ever would in the general population, all because of the brain damage that comes from playing. And all that data was, really where that comes from is just data that the actuaries involved in the litigation sorted through and put together, and trying to kind of lay this out for the federal court judge and clarify things for the federal judge. And that's huge. I mean, that's huge. Then if you kind of sort through it, you'll find that as the NFL and the plaintiffs actually came to an agreement to settle that litigation, I think they had agreed to set up a pool of $675 million for players. And the federal judge looked at that agreement and said that wasn't enough based off of all the evidence that she had. She didn't think that was nearly enough because you not only had the 5,000 players involved in the litigation, but if you project out and include all the other players that aren't involved in the litigation, you potentially have another 20,000 players who would be making claims because of problems created by their head injuries. And so she wouldn't approve that settlement. It sounds like a whole bunch of money, and she said, in her opinion, it wasn't nearly enough, so she wouldn't approve it. And she sent both sides back to kind of work out a different deal. But here's what the big issue is. You've got these repeated concussions, which essentially create symptoms associated with a thing called CTE. Now, CTE you will generally only see in older people. As somebody kind of ages and gets into their 70s or their 80s and they start to have dementia, memory issues, other problems that get created because their brain isn't functioning properly. That's generally when you start to see these, the signs similar to what you see with CTE. But in the general population, you don't see it in 20-year-olds or 30 or 40 or even 50-year-olds. And suddenly in pro football players, we started to see that. And it first came up with a football player who committed suicide, I believe in his 40s. And an autopsy was done, and the pathologist who was doing the autopsy found this abnormality in his brain as part of the autopsy. And that was kind of the initial case that started to key the medical community into CTE in players. And so as everybody started to really look into it, and I can tell you, when I say everybody, really what I'm talking about is you've got, Boston College, who has a brain study center. It's actually let me correct that. It's the Boston University School of Medicine has the Center for the Study of Traumatic Encephalopathy, which that's CTE, is the traumatic encephalopathy. And this is the whole center was developed to study this particular issue. And what they've done is they've taken brains of ex-football players who have passed away, many of whom, quite honestly, have committed suicide. And they've studied those brains. The players have agreed to donate their brains. There was one player in particular that I read about. In his suicide note, before he killed himself, he actually asked that his brain be donated to be studied because he knew something was wrong. And in the vast majority of those brains that have been studied, I believe, please don't hold me to this, but the number was something like 76 out of 78 brains showed CTE, which surprised the researchers because all these ex-players, in their opinion, were far too young to have this CTE pathology. And then what's been really shocking is they've also had some younger players. There was a college player who committed suicide over the last few years. His brain was studied, and surprisingly, CTE was found in his brain, even though he's 21 years old or so. And then the most shocking case is there was a high school player. And during his high school homecoming game, he actually experienced a pretty significant, concussion, or a pretty significant hit that could easily cause a concussion. And later that night, he died at the age of 18. His brain was studied, and the researchers found CTE in his brain, that of an 18-year-old, which was astonishing to them. And it's all related back to this, taking numerous concussive blows. And again, this is an ongoing topic of research. And so there are a lot of places where there really aren't kind of complete, solid answers yet. The things are still being looked at. Because one question is, well, do you have to take huge hits in order to end up in this situation where you have CTE? Or not? And there is some research out there that seems to indicate that the answer is not. That when they go back through and they try to look at players who they've done autopsies on or whose brains they've studied, and then they go back and they look at what active complaints of concussions did this player have when he played. They found that there certainly are players who never seem to have reported a significant concussion. And the conclusion that sort of pushes the researchers towards, but they don't necessarily know if it's completely accurate yet or not, is that you don't have to have one of these significant hits, a significant concussion. It can simply be the continuous concussive hits that, for example, let's say a lineman, an offensive lineman, receives all game long. from hitting whoever he's blocking. And so keep that in mind, because I think that's important. And so when you look at your young players, your kids, and you say, well, so how does this affect us? What should we do about it? One, just again, this is my opinion. This is my show that I do each week. Take it for what it is. I'm just here giving you my opinion. But one, I think if I had a son who wants to play football nowadays, or hockey, or participate in MMA, or actively box, I would research CTE, essentially brain trauma from sports, on athletes. I would get on the internet and start to Google it. And I would start to research it. And I would find videos, I would find TV shows, I would find articles, and I would research it. So you can become well-informed in order to make that decision. A great article is, you can find it online, it's an article written by the New York Times called Brain Trauma to Affect 1 in 3 Players, NFL Agrees. And there's a great article that kind of goes through the NFL, the litigation, all the research. You can actually look up the Boston University School of Medicine Center for the Study of Traumatic Encephalopathy. And in addition to that, you can also look up the Brain Injury Research Institute, because they also study the impact of concussions. And there will be lots of things that they've written, lots of research that they've done and that they've written about that will be helpful to you. Frontline did a fantastic show that I watched probably a year ago. It was on PBS, Frontline, and it was about the NFL and concussions and all the research. And it was fascinating. It really was. So if you want my opinion, what I've taken away from all the research that I've done is, if I had a kid who wanted to play any of these sports that were impact-driven sports, I would not let them do it until they were teenagers. I wouldn't have my 7, 8-year-old kid out playing Pop Warner football. With kids, one of the things the research seems to make clear is there's so little known about the development of the brains, or the development of a brain within a child. And a child's brain is much different than that of an adult. And it's much different than that of a 15 or a 16-year-old. I would not let my 7 or 8-year-old son go out and play any of these full contact sports. If he wants to play football, great, play flag football. Wouldn't have him boxing, wouldn't have him playing ice hockey. I just wouldn't. I wouldn't set my son up at that early age to have brain trauma. I just wouldn't. And I love sports. I love football in particular. I'm not anti-football. I just wouldn't. Now, when he's in high school, if he wants to play football, then that's his decision, and I would support him if he wanted to. But then I would also do my best to make sure that the school actually had legitimately the best equipment that you could possibly have. And if they didn't, then I would figure out how I could, for example, buy the helmet for my son that he should have and put the school's colors and decals on it if the school wasn't willing to do it. Because there have been significant advances in equipment that didn't exist years ago. But it's expensive. I mean, it just is. That's just the way it is. And so I wouldn't want my son using subpar equipment if he's going to play football or any of these other sports. And that would be my approach. And I can tell you, I think fathers certainly who want their sons to be phenomenal athletes have this idea, and I think sometimes it's legitimate, that your kid needs to really start at a young age. and maybe for certain sports. Tiger Woods started playing golf as a little kid. Okay. But I know plenty of phenomenal football players who quite frankly never played any football until their sophomore or junior year of high school. And they were just phenomenal athletes. And quite frankly, those are the players who make it to be college football players, the phenomenal athletes. The ones who make it simply because they started practicing at the age of 6 are few and far between. Now, maybe you have a phenomenal athlete who started at a young age and the two come together and they ended up playing college football. And then the reality is the players who are able to transition from college football to the pros, it's just a very small percentage. And again, it's the best of the best. And a lot of it comes down to pure athletic ability that you're born with. And so, when you factor that piece in, if the idea is, to play sports for fun, as opposed to, the quest to become a professional athlete, but to simply play for fun, there are also lots of other sports. I love baseball. There's soccer, which I never played, really didn't have it when I was a kid, at least in the town I grew up with. But there are lots of sports, swimming, golf, tennis, 1,000 of them that you can play for fun, competition, health, all those other things that don't involve significant contact and concussive hits. Now, again, just my opinion, this is simply meant to provide you all with a topic to think about, with some basic information, and hopefully, if this applies to you and it's something you think you need to look further in, a place to start your research. So until next week, have a great week, and we'll talk to y'all soon.